The winter the family sent Philippa north. There was still ice on the wharf when the carriage crossed it, and the driver did not slow. She had heard the name spoken before she ever heard the man's voice. Morrow. Lord Morrow of Ashdale. The Earl of Ashdale, though no one used the title with any warmth. They said it the way one says the name of a difficult season, not with hatred, but with a kind of settled resignation, the acknowledgement that something large and cold was simply true. She had been seated in the Hargreave drawing-room in Leeds, a copy of her late father's survey maps balanced on her knee, when her Uncle Silas had delivered the arrangement in the same tone he used for livestock prices. His face held no cruelty. It held only the particular satisfaction of a man who has solved a problem cleanly. Lord Morrow requires a wife, her uncle had said, his hand resting on the mantle as if he owned it, as indeed he now did, her father's estate having passed directly to him through the entail. He has written to inquire, and I have answered. "You will go at the new year, I see," Philippa said. Her voice did not shake. What she did not say was that she had heard the name Lord Morrow in darker company than drawing-rooms. She had heard it at her father's table, from a man who had returned from the northern moors with half a winter's color drained from his face. She had heard it from the solicitor's clerk, who processed the tenancy agreements for 3 villages on the Ashdale estate, the ones the Earl governed without appearing at assembly or race or any public occasion for 7 years running. She had heard it most clearly from her cousin Hetty, who had whispered it the previous August as though the name itself could carry cold air through a closed window. "A beast," Hetty had said without elaboration. "They say he is not fit for society." Philippa had folded her father's maps very carefully and placed them in the trunk the footmen were already packing, and she had not argued, because there was nothing left in Leeds to argue for. The journey north took 3 days. On the first morning the roads were mud, on the second they were stone, and on the third they were a pale, compressed nothing that the horses navigated by memory or instinct, the carriage swaying over the moorland track, with a rhythm that was not quite soothing, end quote. Philippa watched the country change through the window. The soft hedged fields of the south gave way to stone walls, the walls to open ground, the open ground to something harder and older, the moor spreading in every direction under a sky, the color of pewter that seemed to press the land flat beneath it. She had never been north of York. She had not imagined it would feel like arriving somewhere that had not agreed to be arrived at. Ashdale Hall was visible from perhaps a mile off, not because it was tall, but because it was the only shape on the horizon that was not the moor itself. It sat above the valley with the settled permanence of something geological, built from the same stone as the outcropping behind it, its windows dark in the afternoon light. No flag flew, no smoke rose from more than 2 chimneys. She counted the windows on the south face as the carriage descended to the gate, the way one counts things in a strange place to steady oneself, and she reached 17 before the trees obscured the view. The housekeeper met her at the door. Mrs. Croft was a woman of 50, with the unhurried authority of someone who had administered a large house through several varieties of difficult circumstance, and she regarded Philippa with the measured courtesy due to the new mistress of a house where the existing mistress's portrait had not yet been removed from the gallery. "His lordship is in the study," Mrs. Croft said. "He asked that you be shown to your rooms first, and that you join him at 6. Philippa was shown to a suite of rooms on the east wing that smelled of lavender and cold stone and something faintly wood-smoke beneath both. The windows gave onto the moor. She stood at them for a long moment before she removed her gloves. At 6 o'clock she descended. He was standing at the window of the study when she was announced, and he did not turn at once. That was the first thing she noticed about him. Not the breadth of his shoulders in the dark coat, not the stillness of his posture, which was the stillness of a man who had chosen stillness rather than been granted it by temperament. What she noticed first was that he did not turn, and that the pause before he did was precisely long enough to be deliberate, and that when he did finally face her, his expression was arranged into something so carefully neutral that the effort of the arrangement was visible to anyone who was paying attention. Philippa was paying attention. Edmund Morrow, Lord Morrow of Ashdale was 37 years old, and he looked it in the way that men who have spent years outdoors and in their own company look it. Not diminished, but used by time in ways that were not uninteresting. He was tall and broad through the chest, his dark hair silvered at the temples, his face angular and weather-marked. There was a scar through his right brow, pale and faded, that had come from somewhere long ago and been forgotten, she supposed, by everyone except the face that carried it. His eyes were gray, the particular gray of the moor outside his window, and they moved over her with a thoroughness that she felt and did not flinch from. "Miss Calder," he said. His voice was low and level. "You have had a long journey." "3 days," she said. "The moors are very large." "They are," he said. Nothing else. She stood her ground and did not fill the silence, which seemed to surprise him. Or she thought it did, because something shifted very briefly in the gray eyes before the neutrality returned. "I have asked Mrs. Croft to prepare dinner for 7:30, he said. "We may speak of the practical arrangements then, if you are agreeable." "I am agreeable," Philippa said, "to whatever you require to discuss." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was necessary before he nodded. It was not an unfriendly nod. It was the nod of a man who had expected something and received something else. She had not yet discovered what he had expected. If you find yourself curious what Philippa carried in that small trunk, what she left behind in Leeds that cost her more than the estate itself, stay with this story. She kept it close, and it mattered more than she yet knew. Dinner the first night was conducted between two people maintaining the courtesies of strangers who understand they will not remain strangers, and navigating that understanding with the limited tools the situation provides. Lord Morrow asked her about her father's work. He knew that Captain Calder had been a surveyor, had spent the last decade mapping the watershed land of the West Riding, and he asked questions about the surveys with the directness of a man accustomed to solitude, who had trained himself to produce conversation when conversation was required. The questions were precise. He listened to her answers with his full attention. She noted that he did not ask whether she had expected to marry someone else. He did not ask whether the arrangement had been her own choice. He did not offer sympathy for her loss, which was recent and conspicuous, and she was grateful for the omission. Sympathy at that table would have undone something she was not yet ready to examine. He asked instead whether she rode. She said she had ridden since she was 8 years old and preferred it to the carriage by some considerable measure. He said he would have a horse readied for her in the morning if she wished. The house was quieter than she had expected for its size. There were servants enough, though not many, and Mrs. Croft ran them with an economy that suited the place and the master. The second day Philippa was shown the estate accounts which Lord Morrow placed before her at the morning-room table, with neither apology nor explanation, as though it were entirely natural that a woman had arrived in his house and would require to understand its workings before anything further proceeded. The accounts were well kept, the estate was solvent, the tenants in the 3 villages were neither prosperous nor suffering, and the margins were thin but honest. "You maintain them yourself," she said. Not a question. "I have no steward," he said. "The last one was unsuitable." She wanted to ask unsuitable in what respect, but something in the set of his jaw told her the subject was closed, and she had learned enough already about which silences in this house were doors and which were walls. She rode that morning on a grey mare named Pollen, which seemed a fragile name for a horse built for moorland, and discovered it was entirely appropriate. Pollen picked her way along the high track, with an intelligent caution that Philippa admired, and the moor opened before her in the cold January light, as it had not opened from the carriage window, immense and particular and strangely intimate at this pace. She rode for 2 hours. When she returned to the stable yard, Lord Morrow was there, his own horse being walked by a groom, and he watched her dismount with the same measuring attention he had given her in the study the evening before. "You ride well," he said. "My father taught me." She said, "He said a woman who could not navigate the land was half blind in it." Something moved in his face at that. It was not a smile. It was a thing that might become one, given time and sufficient reason, but had not yet committed to the effort. She carried that almost smile with her through the morning, and did not examine it closely, because she had learned already that certain things in this place were best approached from the side rather than directly. Her uncle Silas wrote in the third week to inquire whether the arrangement had proved satisfactory, and his letter contained, in its final paragraph, a phrase that lodged in her chest with the precision of something intended to lodge there. He wrote that he trusted the northern air had suited her, and that, of course, she would understand the arrangement had been the kindest available resolution for a young woman of no particular income and no particular prospects, the phrase delivered in his patient epistolary voice as though it were a gift rather than a verdict. A young woman of no particular prospects. That was the name for her in the world Silas Hargreave administered. She had heard it in various forms since her father's death 5 months prior. She had heard it from her aunt, who had said over the funeral meats that Philippa must be practical now, a woman alone being a problem requiring a solution. She had heard it from the solicitor's clerk in his careful hedged language from her cousin Hetty's husband, who had suggested in the gentlest possible terms that the house in Leeds could not accommodate another permanent resident, and from the various members of the Leeds assembly rooms who had managed, over the course of a single autumn season, to look at her as though she had already receded from their acquaintance. She folded Silas's letter and placed it in the small rosewood box she kept on her dressing table, beside her father's compass, which she had kept from the trunk of surveying instruments that had been sold to pay the inheritance fees. The compass was small and worn, its brass case rubbed thin at the hinge. She did not open it often. She opened it that night, turning the needle north, and let it settle. North had a different meaning now. She showed Lord Morrow the estate maps on a Thursday afternoon in the second week, not because he had asked, but because she had found them in the library and noticed several discrepancies between the boundaries drawn and the boundaries the tenancy agreements described. She spread the maps on the library table and pointed to the places where the line wandered from the document, and he stood beside her and looked, and she was aware of his height and the warmth his body put into the cold library air with a specificity that she registered in her throat and did not permit herself to name. "My father surveyed land like this," she said. "The discrepancy there is likely a drainage shift if the beck has moved over 30 years. And this one here could be enclosure that was never mapped." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "My solicitor has been arguing this boundary for 4 years with the Fenwick estate." "Perhaps he has been arguing the wrong boundary," she said. He looked at her then directly, and there was something in the gray eyes that was not the assessment she had seen on the first evening. It was closer to recognition, and it lasted long enough to make her aware of her own stillness. "I would like you to explain that to him." Lord Morrow said, his voice level in full. She did. The following Tuesday, the solicitor arrived from Harrogate, and Philippa sat at the morning-room table with the maps and the tenancy documents and spoke for 40 minutes about drainage, boundary shifts, and the habits of becks in the West Riding, and the solicitor, a man named Mr. Gadd. Follow, who had come expecting a new countess to pour tea at him, sat very still and took notes, and did not interrupt, because the argument was exact and the evidence was in front of him. Lord Morrow said nothing during that meeting. He sat to one side, slightly back, and listened, and when it was done, and the solicitor had taken his leave with the maps tucked under his arm, and an expression of controlled surprise, Lord Morrow said only, "Well done, Miss Calder." It was a simple thing to say. It was said without flourish. She felt it settle somewhere behind her breastbone, with a warmth she was not prepared for. Lord Morrow had been married before. She had known this before she came north, and knowing, it had not prepared her for the texture of the knowledge inside the house itself. There was a portrait in the upstairs gallery, a woman with fair hair and a composed expression, her gown painted in the soft ivory of a decade past, her eyes directed at something the painter had placed just outside the frame. The portrait was not turned to the wall. It hung where it had always hung, and the fact of its hanging seemed to Philippa a more complicated thing than either grief or indifference. His name for this was not given to her. It came out on a February evening when a storm had been moving across the moor for 2 days, and the house had contracted inward against the cold, the fires burning high, the corridors dim, and they had spent the afternoon in the library with the maps and a problem of tenant access rights that had developed a legal dimension. The candles were low when she found the letter in the folded map case. It was addressed to Edmund, in a woman's hand, and it was unopened, and it was old. She held it for a moment without meaning to, and then set it back. And he came in from the corridor, to find her looking at the map case with her hand still. She said nothing. She was not obliged to speak. He crossed to the table and looked at the case, and then at her. And then he took the letter from the case and placed it in his coat pocket with a deliberateness that was not anger and not embarrassment, but something harder to name, something that looked like the management of a grief that had been managed so long it had become structural, had become load-bearing. My wife, he said, was not well during our last years here. I was in London more than I should have been. A pause. The letter was written in her final month. I was told of it after her death. I have not been able to open it. Philippa sat with this for a moment. How long has it been? 6 years, he said. She did not offer sympathy. She was not sure what she had to offer that would be adequate, or that was within the permissions of their current understanding. She said after a moment, "You must have loved her very much." He looked at the fire. "I failed her," he said. That is the part that stays. She remembered that sentence for a long time after, the part that stays. It did not seem to her that a man who failed a person entirely would be unable to open a letter from them 6 years on. It seemed to her the reverse, that the inability to open the letter was evidence of a love that had not had room to prove itself before the end came. She did not say any of this. She was not certain of the permissions. That evening they sat by the fire longer than they had before, and the conversation moved into other channels, and twice he said something dry and particular about the moor in summer that made her breath catch with something adjacent to laughter. The first she had felt in 5 months, and she did not suppress it entirely. And he watched the moment with an attention that had nothing clinical in it. The letter sat in his coat pocket all evening. She was aware of it, the way one is aware of a thing that has been deliberately not discussed. She had not yet understood what she was beginning to want. She did not permit herself to investigate the question. The representative from her uncle Silas arrived in March. His name was Mr. Bohr Dalton, and he came on behalf of the Hargreave family interest, which was the interest of Silas Hargreave and his eldest son, and the considerable property that had once been Captain Calder's and was now in the process of being absorbed into the adjacent estate. Mr. Dalton was a man of 40, with a city solicitor's manner and a provincial solicitor's particular talent for saying things that were entirely correct on their surface and offensive at their depth. He arrived on a Tuesday, was given tea by Mrs. Croft, and delivered his purpose at dinner, with a patience that struck Philippa as rehearsed. Her uncle wished to assure himself that the arrangement at Ashdale was proceeding to her satisfaction. Her uncle also wished, and here Mr. Dalton paused for a sip of claret, to raise a matter of some delicacy. It had come to the family's attention that the arrangement, while publicly understood to be a marriage agreement, had not yet been formalized by any legal instrument, and the family wished to ensure that proper protections were in place for Miss Calder's welfare. Lord Morrow set down his glass. "What protections," he said, his voice very level, "does the family feel are lacking, Mr.?" Dalton smiled his careful smile, and said that it was simply a matter of proper settlement, and that the Hargreave family's solicitors had prepared a document specifying Miss Calder's future maintenance. In the event the arrangement did not proceed to its natural conclusion, Philippa saw from the single sentence she was permitted to read, specified that in the event of the arrangement's dissolution she would receive an annual income of £120, paid through the Hargreave estate, in return for which she agreed to make no further claim on any Hargreave property. It was the entailment of the one thing she still had left, her legal claim to her father's library, which under the original bequest had been willed to her directly, and which Silas had been disputing for 5 months. She set her knife down. She said nothing. Lord Morrow looked at the document for a long moment. He looked at it with the gray eyes and the stillness of a man reading something he has understood at once and is choosing to read a second time for reasons of precision. Then he folded it in half and placed it beside his plate. "Miss Calder's affairs," he said. are no longer the Hargreave families to arrange. I suggest Mr. Dalton convey that to her uncle. Mr. Dalton said that he understood, but that, of course, it was simply a matter of family concern, and that given Miss Calder was of no particular income and no particular settled position, until the marriage was formalized, it seemed only natural that the family should wish to ensure her interests were secured. No particular income and no particular settled position. Philippa heard it for the third time in this different room, from this different mouth, and it landed in a different place than it had the other times, lower and heavier, and she felt a familiar cold of the verdict settling over her like weather. Lord Morrow looked at Mr. Dalton. Miss Calder, he said, has been managing this estate's boundary disputes, tenancy agreements, and drainage surveys for 6 weeks. She identified a legal error that my solicitor had failed to locate in 4 years of argument. Her income and position are not your concern, or her uncle's. They are mine. I recommend you finish your dinner. Mr. Dalton finished his dinner. He left the following morning, without the document signed. After he was gone, Philippa stood in the morning room with her father's compass open in her palm and the needle settling north, and she did not cry. Which she had not done in 5 months, and she did not cry now, but she stood very still and let the warmth of what had happened enter her slowly, the way warmth enters a cold room, by degrees, by diffusion, by the patient replacement of one condition with another. She did not see Lord Morrow until the afternoon. He was in the stable yard tending to a horse that had developed a bruised foreleg, and she went to stand nearby, without quite approaching, watching him work with his hands, the coat discarded, the sleeves turned back. He handled the horse with a matter-of-fact gentleness that she had begun to notice he applied to most things he cared for. The quieter the caring, the more genuine. She said, "You did not have to do that." "No," he said without looking up. End of. Mr. Dalton will report to my uncle that you were obstructive. Yes, he said. She looked at the back of his neck, the dark hair and the tension held there, from some internal discipline she had not yet been permitted to name. Why, she said. He stood up then and looked at her, and the gray eyes had something in them that was no longer careful, that was rawer than the management he usually showed. Because he was wrong, he said. His voice was very low. And you were sitting at that table and you were not going to say so. She held the compass in her closed hand and felt the edge of the case against her palm. I was considering how to say so, she said. I know, he said. I did not want you to have to. They stood in the stable yard with the horse between them and the moor behind, and the wind came down off the high ground with the particular cold of late March that feels like winter declining to leave, and neither of them moved for a moment that lasted longer than it should have, in which she was aware of the distance between them as a specific quantity, measurable and of wanting it to be less. She did not close it. He did not close it. The horse breathed between them. She said, I will need to write to the solicitor about the library. My solicitor, he said, use mine. She nodded and turned back toward the house, and she was 3 paces away when she heard him say, very quietly, Philippa, just her name. Not Miss Calder. Tur. Just the first syllable, and then the rest in his low-level voice, as though he had been considering whether to say it for some time, and had decided. She did not turn around. She did not trust herself to turn around. She kept walking, and she held the compass very steady in her closed hand, and the needle inside pointed north. The incident in the village happened in the 4th week of March, at the weekly market that was held in the square of the nearest settlement, Ashdale Crossing. A gathering of perhaps 60 people and a dozen stalls in the shadow of the old church. Lord Morrow had taken her to introduce her to the tenants, which he had done without ceremony, presenting her simply as Miss Calder, who was recently arrived at the hall, and the tenants had received her with the wary warmth of people who have learned to wait and see. There was a woman there, a widow named Mrs. Hay, whose eldest son had a debt to the estate that had accumulated during the hard winter of 2 years prior, when the sheep had been lost to murrain and the family had borrowed against the following year's rent. The debt stood at £12. The son, a young man of perhaps 20, had come to the market with his mother and his 2 younger sisters, and he had the look of a man who had been carrying something that was about to become too heavy to carry. Philippa had been standing near the bread stall speaking with the baker's wife about whether the mill at the north end of the village produced a finer flour than the mill at the south, which was the kind of conversation she had learned to conduct with a genuine interest she did not have to perform, when she heard the exchange. One of the tenant farmers, an older man named Granger, was speaking to Mrs. Hayes' son with the particular authority of a man whose own position is secure enough to remark on others. "Lord Morrow will not wait another season," Granger said, not unkindly, only certain. "The arrear's too long. A young woman of no settled means came up from Leeds, and he's to marry her for her property. He has none to spare on the hay debt." She heard it as though the words were addressed directly to her, which they were not. Granger had not seen her. He was speaking of her as a piece of the estate's financial architecture, which was not unreasonable, which was what she was in the public understanding, and the words had the quality of something factual, and she stood with the bread roll in her hand and the baker's wife looking at her with a newly uncertain expression, and she breathed through it. She went to Lord Morrow. She found him speaking with the blacksmith, and she waited until there was a natural break in the exchange. And she said quietly, "The hay debt." He looked at her. £12, she said. Mrs. Hayes' son has been doing 3 men's work on that holding since the murrain. I spoke with Mrs. Croft, and she confirmed it. The family has been paying in kind for 2 years. Repairs to the Northfield wall, labor on the drainage ditch, and 3 seasons of lambing work that the estate books record as miscellaneous labor, but which Mr. Brax, Croft tells me, is the hay boy. If you counted it at the standard daily rate, it comes to £9.11. He listened without speaking. "I am not asking you to forgive the debt," she said. "I'm telling you. The numbers are wrong." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Have you spoken to young Hay? Directly?" "No," she said. "I am speaking to you." He nodded. He crossed the square to where Thomas Hay was standing, with his mother and his sisters, and he spoke for 3 minutes, and she could not hear the words, but she could see the young man's face change, the weight of it shifting, and she could see Mrs. Go. Hay's hand go to her mouth and then drop, and she watched from the bread stall as Lord Morrow came back across the square. "Correct," was all he said, passing her on the way to the blacksmith. Something in her chest had become difficult to manage. The spring assembly at Harrogate, in the 2nd week of April, was the first occasion they entered public society together, and it was not Philippa's idea. Lord Morrow had been formally invited, as he was every year, and formally declined, as he had done, for 7 years. The invitation had been delivered the 3rd week of March by a footman from the Pemberton family who organized the assembly rooms, and Lord Morrow had set it on the table in the library and not mentioned it, and Philippa had set it back on the table and not mentioned it either, and for a week it had sat between them like a third party to their arrangement. She raised it on a Wednesday morning. She said simply, "The Pemberton Assembly is in 3 weeks." He looked up from the drainage records. "You have declined for 7 years," she said. "I understand why. I am not suggesting you are obliged to attend. You wish to go," he said. It was not a question. "I think it would be useful," she said. "If we are to be understood as a settled arrangement and not an oddity, it would be useful to be seen together." He held her gaze. "For your sake," he said. "Or for the estate's?" She considered. "Perhaps for mine," she said. "I find I am somewhat tired of being discussed in absentia." Something in his face moved. He looked back at the records. Then he said, "I will write to accept." The assembly was held in the rooms above the baths, 3 sets of dancing, and a supper table, and perhaps 150 people in the particular state of alert sociability that the county gentry achieve when they have been looking forward to an occasion all winter, and are determined to extract value from it. They arrived at 8:30. Lord Morrow handing her down from the carriage with a precision that had nothing automatic in it, which she registered through the back of her gloved hand. She was known to some of them, the Leeds connections, the women who had met her at her father's table or at the subscription library. Though she had not been in this company in years, she was not known to most. She was known, however, as a subject, as the woman Lord Morrow had brought north, the arrangement everyone had heard about from someone else's version of it. Lady Pemberton approached them in the first set with a warmth that had calculation in its architecture, though Philippa did not hold that against her, because all warmth in this room had calculation in it. That was the nature of the season. "Lord Morrow," Lady Pemberton said, her fan making a small gesture of genuine surprise. "We are delighted. And this must be Miss Calder." "Miss Calder," Lord Morrow confirmed. Lady Pemberton looked at Philippa with the particular attention of a woman who is measuring something and does not intend to be seen measuring. Then she said pleasantly, "You are a great deal younger than I had expected." She had not expected any specific age. The sentence was not about age. Lord Morrow said, "Miss Calder has been managing the Ashdale estate maps for the past 6 weeks. Mr. Fallow has found her corrections to be of considerable value." Lady Pemberton blinked. Mr. Fallow was the Harrogate solicitor, whom half this room used for one purpose or another. The mention of his name in this context rearranged the sentence's meaning with a small, precise click. "How interesting," Lady Pemberton said, and her expression held a quality that was not entirely the one she had brought to the conversation. The dancing began. Lord Morrow danced the first set with her, which was a declaration of a particular kind in this room, a room in which his presence, after 7 years' absence, was already a declaration. And the combination of the two produced an attention that she felt on her back and her shoulders and the nape of her neck throughout the first movement. She danced well. He danced with the contained economy of a man who had learned to dance and maintained the skill as a matter of form rather than pleasure, and they moved through the figures, together with a precision that required attention, and that attention required proximity. And the proximity required her to manage her own breath in ways she was not certain she managed entirely. In the second figure, he said, his voice onto the music, "You are being watched." "I know," she said. "Does it trouble you?" "Less than it once would have," she said. And it was true. 6 weeks ago, watched had meant assessed and found wanting. Watched now had a different color. They were at supper when the woman from York arrived at their table. Her name was Mrs. Letitia Fenwick, and she was the wife of the man whose estate boundary Lord Morrow had been disputing for 4 years, and she was 35. Handsome in the way of a woman who has always been told she is handsome and has organized her personality accordingly. She sat beside Lord Morrow with the ease of long acquaintance, which Philippa registered without reaction, and she spoke to him for several minutes, in the low, warm register of a conversation not designed to include the person across the table. Wah! Then she looked at Philippa with a smile that had been carefully constructed. "You must find the North very different from Leeds," Mrs. Fenwick said. "A young woman of no particular connections dropped into such an establishment. It must be overwhelming." Lord Morrow put down his fork. Mrs. Fenwick continued pleasantly. "Lord Morrow has always been such a private person. We have all wondered what sort of woman would suit him, given his rather particular circumstances." His rather particular circumstances. The rooms, the absence from society, the wound that no one named. "Directly, I find," Philippa said, keeping her voice at the same level as Mrs. Fenwick's, "that the North has a great deal to recommend it. The landscape rewards close attention, and Lord Morrow has been generous enough to give me close access to the estate's workings, which are better managed than I had any reason to expect." Mrs. Fenwick's smile held. "And I suspect," Philippa continued, setting down her own fork, "that the boundary survey we completed last month will be of interest to your husband, once Mr. Fallow presents the revised maps to his solicitor. We found that the disputed parcel has not in fact belonged to the Fenwick estate since the enclosure of 1804. The smile, very slightly, did not hold. Lord Morrow looked at Philippa across the supper table. and what was in his face in that moment was not neutral, and was not managed. It was something she had not seen there before, open and certain, and it lasted only a breath before it was contained again, but she had seen it, and it rearranged something in her chest that had been uncertain. She was not, she understood, a woman of no particular connections. She was a woman of one particular connection, and it was the one seated across from her, and it was becoming very difficult to think of it as an arrangement. The drive home from Harrogate was quiet. The moor dark past the carriage windows, the stars occluded by cloud, and they sat across from each other with the rocking of the carriage between them. And she was aware of the distance and the warmth and the letter that she had not stopped thinking about for 6 weeks, the one that sat in his coat pocket, and whether he had ever taken it out. She said without premeditation, "Have you read it yet?" He knew at once what she meant. He sat with the question for a long time. "No," he said. She nodded. He said after another silence, "I have thought about it more. These past weeks." She did not ask him why. She looked at the dark window, the nothing outside, and let the question rest. "Philippa," he said, in the same voice he had used in the stable yard, deliberate and low. She looked at him. "I am going to ask you a question," he said, "and I would like you to answer it precisely. Not as a matter of courtesy, and not on account of the arrangement." "Yes," she said. "Are you content here?" She held his gaze. That, outside, the moor moved invisibly in the dark. Inside, the carriage held the warmth of two people who had been in each other's close company for 6 weeks, and had not yet said anything directly about what that had produced. "I am more content than I have been in 5 months, she said. "That is not a small thing." "No," he said. "It is not." He reached across the carriage and took her hand, the gloved hand, and held it, and did not say anything more. And she sat with the weight of his hand over hers, and felt something in her chest that was not grief, and not merely gratitude, and was more than either of them had named. The warmth of it stayed in her palm all the way across the moor. He read the letter on a Friday morning, in late April, alone in the library, and she did not know this until he came to find her in the morning room, where she was working on the new boundary survey, and she looked up at his face and saw that something had shifted in it, a long-held weight redistributed. He sat across from her and said nothing for a moment. She set her pen down. "She forgave me," he said, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "That is what it says." She sat with this. The fire crackled. Outside, the first real warmth of the year was moving across the moor, and the last snow on the high ground had begun to go. "Then you may stop carrying it as a verdict," she said gently. He looked at her for a long time. Quote, "I did not expect," he said slowly, "that you would be what you are." "What am I?" she said. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his gray eyes on hers with the directness of a man who has decided to stop managing the thing he feels. "Someone I find myself unwilling to lose," he said. That is precise enough. Her heart did something unsteady. She kept her voice steady. "Then, do not lose me," she said. He reached across the boundary maps and took her hand, and this time the glove was not between them, because she had been working without them, and the warmth of his hand against hers was a different warmth than the carriage, and she felt it from her fingers to somewhere considerably further inward. He said, "Philippa, will you marry me in actual fact, and not as a matter of arrangement?" She looked at the survey maps, the carefully corrected boundaries, the land that had been disputed and was now known. And then she looked at him.
"Yes,"
she said.
"I will."
The announcement was made at a small dinner in May, at the home of Sir Robert Kendley, the nearest magistrate, whose wife had been agitating for the occasion since March. It was not a large gathering, 22 people at a table built for 30, the candles lit and the spring air coming through the long windows from the garden, and Philippa sat to Lord Morrow's right and felt the particular quality of being in a room full of people who have revised their understanding. Mrs. Fenwick was present, her husband having accepted the surveyor's findings regarding the disputed boundary, with a grace that suggested he had expected them eventually. She sat further down the table and did not address Philippa directly, and her expression, when it rested on the head of the table, held something that was closer to honest reassessment than resentment. Lady Kenley made the toast. Lord Morrow stood, and the room went quiet. And he looked at Philippa with the grey eyes, and the open face she had seen in the carriage, and in the library. And he said, in the room's held silence, "Miss Calder has agreed to be my wife, and I am honored to say so." 12 words. She counted them, in the stillness, after. The room responded with the warm sound of a verdict revised, glasses raised, the particular warmth of people who are genuinely glad to be relieved of a narrative they had never quite believed in. Lady Kenley said to her husband in a voice that was meant to carry, "I knew she had sense from the first letter Edmund sent. Did I not say so?" Lord Morrow caught Philippa's eye across the toast. In his face, for the first time in her presence, was something unmistakably amused, warm and brief and real, gone before the room could see it, meant only for her. She looked away first because she needed to, and she looked at her wine-glass and let the warmth of it settle into her like the spring was settling into the moor quietly. By degrees, by the slow and patient replacement of cold, with something that would hold. They were married in June, quietly, at the church in Ashdale Crossing, with Mrs. Croft and old Granger, the farmer, and Thomas Hay and his mother in the front pews, and the Kenley family, and Mr. Rye. Follow the solicitor looking pleased with himself for reasons he could not quite articulate. There was a letter from her Uncle Silas waiting at the hall when they returned, congratulatory in tone, expressing the hope that the library dispute could now be set aside in the spirit of family warmth. She let Lord Morrow read it, and he set it on the table, and she saw in his face the intention to have his solicitor address the question of the library before the week was out, which he did, and the matter was resolved by August in her favor. And the books arrived from Leeds in a hired cart and were shelved in the Ashdale Library over the course of 3 afternoons, during which Lord Morrow carried the heavier crates from the cart, and she directed their placement, and there was in this a companionable quality that was also a kind of private pleasure. She had not had words for 5 months ago, and was beginning to have words for now. She kept her father's compass on the writing table in the morning room, beside the survey maps. She opened it sometimes in the early hours before breakfast, when the moor was grey and still outside the window, and the hall was quiet around her, and she let the needles settle. The letter, the folded one from the gallery, portrait, was placed in the box in his study. Not hidden, not displayed, acknowledged. She had asked him once whether he wished to keep it private, and he had said, his voice level, that he did not think the past and the present needed to be kept from each other, only understood as different things. She thought that was a sound observation about most things. By the first autumn, she had written every track on the estate, and several that were not on the maps, and had added them. By December she knew the name of every tenant's eldest child and the state of every field drainage. By the winter solstice, when the moor lay white under the shortest day and the fires burned high in every room, and the 3-year-old niece of Thomas Hay arrived at the kitchen door with a jar of black-currant preserve and a card that said Miss Philippa in large, uncertain letters. She understood that she had become the kind of person this place had been waiting for. Not waiting. Deliberately. Not by design or prophecy. Simply waiting, the way cold rooms wait, until the warmth has come and the conditions for it have accumulated, without drama, without announcement, without any single moment being the whole of the thing. She found Lord Morrow Edmund in the library that evening, reading by the fire, the lamp on the table, the letter from the gallery in its box on the shelf behind him. She sat across from him and said nothing, and he set his book down and looked at her with the grey eyes and the face that was by now familiar enough that its expressions were a language she had been learning for months. He said, "You look very satisfied with something." "I am," she said. He waited. "I am satisfied," she said. "With North." He smiled then fully. The thing that had been considering commitment since January committing itself entirely, and she felt it land with the warmth of the preserve jar still in her hands. The needle settled, the moor beyond the window holding its cold and its dark and its vast particular patience, and the fire burning steady against all of it. Thank you for sitting with Philippa's story from its cold beginning to here. If her stubbornness moved you, or the letter that sat so long unopened, leave a word below. It means more than you might think to those of us on this side of the telling.